Welcome to Reddit Aliens. What's the scariest story you've ever heard, real or fake, internet or not? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. So back in the 1970s, my mom was a teenager living in Houston. She and her 9 siblings lived in the Heights, which she says is a nice neighborhood now, but at the time was something of a slum. Her family was super poor. Anyways, my mom had a crush on one of her brother's friends. She was around 14 or 15 at the time. He was a few years older, but she was in love. His name was Mark. Well, around this time, boys started disappearing from the neighborhood. They weren't leaving notes or telling anyone that they were leaving. The families were calling the police, but the police weren't doing anything about it. They decided that the boys had run away and never really looked into it further. After all, these were poor kids living in a bad neighborhood. They ran away all the time. Life goes on. One day, Mark disappears too. Meanwhile, my mom's younger brother is hitching a ride out to the beach to go fishing. He did this on a regular basis and would bum a ride from anyone. On the way to the beach, the guy driving the car stops to fill up the gas tank. The guy working at the gas station, Mom says they called him Weird Larry, sees my uncle and asks who he's with. My uncle replies that he doesn't actually know the guy. Larry won't let my uncle go any further and makes him get out of the car. The driver goes on without him. Now then, 3 years have passed since boys started disappearing, and they finally find out what happened. A man had been paying 2 boys to lure teenage boys to his house, where he drugged them, strapped them to a wooden chair, tortured them, raped them, and killed them. There were at least 28 victims, and Mark Scott was one of them. The only reason they found out was because the 2 teenagers murdered the serial killer, then told the police about all the murders and led them to some of the bodies. And guess who picked up my uncle that day? He was going fishing. There was this one R.L. Stein story that always freaked me out. I'll make up names and I'll try to tell the gist of it. There was this kid, Jerry, who had to go to hospital to have his tonsils out, so he's staying in a room with a few other beds. There's a kid in the bed next to him called Ben, except whenever someone calls him by his name, he says, "I'm not Ben." Ben's mom tells Jerry it's because Ben has to have his leg amputated and he does not want to lose it. The night of Ben's surgery, the nurses come in to wheel Ben to the operating room, but they approach Jerry's bed. The chart here says Ben, says the nurse, and they start wheeling off Jerry. Jerry says, "But I'm not Ben." The nurse then says to the other, "Oh, he's always saying that apparently." Jerry then looked over to Ben's bed, where Ben is sitting smiling. I think the true fear in that short story is that medical mishaps happen probably more regularly than are reported. So, obviously it's not real, but that's pretty freaky. From the all-time top of r/no sleep, credit to Yellow Valley. About 10 years ago, I was recently divorced and living alone in a 1-bedroom apartment. The place was clean and the rent was decent. One of those places that had a doorman. I felt safe here. I was alone and loving it, focused on my career and not on my clingy ex-husband. Things were finally looking up for me. At the time, I was working pretty late at the office and would often stumble into my apartment sleep-deprived in the early hours of the morning and wake up by 6:30, 7ish to start the day. I started noticing that in the morning my door would be unlocked sometimes. I usually dismissed this as my sleep-dead brain thinking that the bed looked more appealing than locking the door. Another thing that I noticed since moving in was that I seemed to misplace things more than I used to. Little things like a hairbrush or nail polish, that sort of thing. It wasn't really that big of a deal, just enough to be a slight annoyance in my day. The longer I lived there, the more frequently I seemed to forget to lock the door. At first, it was every once in a while, then it seemed like an almost daily occurrence. More things were missing. Things like pictures, shaving razors, and most disturbingly, my underwear. This went on for long enough that I started to get a little paranoid. I started to take the time at night to make sure the door was locked. I get into a habit of every night after I lock the door to turn the handle 3 times and say to myself, "It's locked, it's locked, it's locked." Time after time, I would wake up and my door would be unlocked. One time, I even tried staying up all night to watch the door. but I ended up falling asleep in my chair. I decided that in my mind was not reliable enough to stay up all night, so I invested in a video camera. I went all out and bought the fanciest camera that I could get my hands on. So, one night I set the camera up facing the door. I hid the camera under a pile of towels on the floor. I locked the door and went to bed. When I woke up, my apartment looked normal. Nothing missing that I could see. I decided to check the tape. I fast-forwarded through hours of footage not seeing anything. I was just about to give up when I noticed the handle of the door jitter. Then, it slowly crept open. A figure slid through the half-open door and walked towards the camera. It paused, looks around as if it was listening for something, then walked forward into direct view of the camera. I paused the camera. The hairs on my arms and the back of my neck started to rise. I was staring directly into the face of the maintenance man of the building. I could see those big, thick glasses and curly hair. I had no doubt who it was. I played the tape a little more. He looked comfortable as he walked around the apartment. Then he returned and walked toward my bedroom and out of view of the camera. I didn't know what to do. Sobbing, I called the police. I tried to explain over the phone but couldn't. Soon enough, 2 officers arrived at my doorstep. I told them everything and showed them the tape. I remember seeing the blood drain from their faces. They promised me that I was safe and that they were going to get this guy. I needed to lay down but didn't want to be alone. One of the officers offered to stand outside my apartment door as I took a nap. As I was laying in bed unable to sleep, but too drained to move, something kept nagging at me. I laid there for a few minutes tossing and turning, unable to get comfortable or rest. My mind was racing. Then a realization slowly washed over me and chilled me to the bone. We watched the tape and saw the man enter my home, but we never saw him leave. I froze, then started shaking. I needed to get to the front door. I sat up and looked around the room. I couldn't see anymore. I swung my legs over the side of the bed cautiously. My feet hit the cold wood floor, and I felt warm breath on my ankles. I raced out of my apartment as fast as I could to the safety of the police officer. He called for backup. They found the man under my bed, clutching a knife and a Polaroid camera. Did anyone read that article about the girl who called her mom while she was being eaten alive by a bear? That was scary not only because being eaten by a bear sounds terrifying, but also because it would be horrifying to get a call from your daughter screaming for help, and there's nothing you can do. A girl in her teens gets called upon to babysit some kids on a Friday evening. Apparently, she watches those 2 girls pretty regularly. Anyway, the parents leave for the evening and said they wouldn't be home until around midnight. The teenager puts the 2 girls to bed around 9 p.m. She does what most people would do, goes downstairs and watches TV for a while. She watches TV for an hour or so, and by this point, it's getting pretty late. She's in the living room on the main level. The TV sits in the corner of the room with large windows on each side of it. Suddenly, she, out of the corner of her eyes, sees what she thinks is someone walking by the window outside through the bushes. Naturally, she gets pretty freaked out. She ends up calling 911, and the police arrive. The police check outside, don't find any signs of anyone walking around. I guess it was winter with snow on the ground. The police officers assure her she's safe, and that the lighting from both the TV and the lamp probably played tricks on her by reflecting off the window. The teen agrees that's probably what it was, yet asks them to check inside the house for her just to be safe. The police reluctantly oblige and start randomly checking rooms, closets, and the garage a bit haphazardly. They roll their eyes a bit as they wonder how much this girl's imagination has run wild. Well, turns out they find a man hiding underneath one of the little girl's beds. I guess as the story goes, it was the little girl's mother's ex-husband. The babysitter didn't see someone walk past the window outside. What she saw was the reflection of him walking behind the couch. A man is driving a regular route along the highway when he notices a turnoff that will take him up through the mountains. He figures he drives this way all the time, but has never taken the mountain path, even though it will only take him a few hours longer to reach his destination. As a spur-of-the-moment decision, he takes the turn and begins his journey up the winding road. He'd started his drive later in the day than usual, so the sky is getting dark as he approached the top, but the view is gorgeous. While he continues, he gets a small chill at the base of his neck. but dismisses it as cool mountain air. Not long after, he has to slow his car as he approaches what appears to be a nasty car accident. Two cars, completely totaled, look like they hit each other head-on just after rounding a corner. The man can see a few bodies on the ground, all bloodied and not moving. Immediately, he knows he has to pull over and help, but he can't stop, some sixth sense telling him something about the scene is wrong, like isn't natural. He decides he's going to drive his car forward and park it just beyond the crash site before getting out to help. He slowly creeps by the wreck and manages a better look at one of the bodies. It's definitely human, but something seems amiss, but he still can't place it. He rolls the car forward maybe 6 meters from the crash site as he's about to come to a stop and open his door to investigate. He looks out his front windshield for a moment. It's gotten terribly dark now, nearly pitch black, when something in his rearview mirror catches the eye. Several somethings, in fact. As he gazes in the mirror in horror, he can see the bodies of both crash victims illuminated by the rear lights. All of them are sitting up, staring directly at his car, eyes like glowing orbs in the mirror. He panics. Suddenly more people come out from the ditches and forest surrounding the road, but only when the crash victim bodies begin to stand, seemingly fine, no limps or dragging themselves, does he have the presence of mind to throw the car back into drive. By the time the first people are taking careful steps toward the vehicle, he's already speeding as fast as he can around the bend and getting the hell out of the mountain. Nothing ever came for him, nor did he seem he was ever followed. Sometimes he wonders if his mind played a trick on him, but he still to this day, he always checks his rearview mirror before ever stepping out of the car. The Lake Bodom murders were an infamous multiple homicide that took place in Finland in 1960. Lake Bodom is a lake by the city of Espoo, about 22 kilometers west of the country's capital Helsinki. In the early hours of June 5, 1960, 4 teenagers were camping on the shores of Lake Bodom. Between 4 a.m. and 6 a.m., an unknown person or people murdered 3 of them with a knife and blunt instrument, wounding the 4th. The sole survivor, Niels Wilhelm Gustafsson, led a normal life until 2004, when he became a suspect and was subsequently charged. In October 2005, a district court found Gustafsson not guilty of all charges against him. The murders have proven to be a popular subject in the Finnish media and commonly return to the headlines whenever new information or theories surface. But the case is still unsolved and will probably remain a mystery. Sure, fiction is fun and a great escape from reality, but the real-life mysteries really are intriguing. So, any updates from this case that anyone knows about? Alright, I figured I'd share one of my own. This story was told to me by my great-aunt, one of my grandmother's 9 sisters. In Cuba, where we're all from, the summer tends to get hot. Coupled with the lack of air conditioning, you'd have to be wealthy to own a unit. People tend to sleep with doors and windows open. One night, my Aunt T was putting her grandchildren to sleep. She laid in bed with them, and they were alone in the home. One of her sisters, Berta, was supposed to be keeping them company tonight, but some last-minute event made her change where she slept that night. My Aunt T says that sometime around 9 p.m., she noticed the figure, who, by her description, must have been 7 feet tall. It was human-shaped, but seemed to float inside their home. If it had legs, they weren't visible because a long robe or some sort covered them and dragged along her floor. At this point, rather than scream in fear, my Aunt T decided to lay perfectly still so as to not wake the children. She sees the figure cross the hallway and heads into her room, looming ominously over them. The face, she described, was that of a pale woman with big red lips and her hair in dreads, like that of a Rastafarian man. There were just shadows, cavities as she called it, where her eyes would have been. It left her room through the same way it entered, but didn't leave. My aunt's house is large, and she swears she saw the figure go in and out of each room, take about the same amount of time, then leave. Eventually, she ran out of places in the home to visit and simply glided out the front door. My aunt cries to this very day because the next morning, her sister Berta was found dead. Everyone thought it must have been some sort of heart attack or stroke in her sleep because no one heard anything. And they found her where she had laid the night before, only lifeless. My aunt swears the thing must have been death itself, searching for her sister when she should have been. My cousin was in a band and did some touring for a while. He ran into another band from the Illinois area that had a creepy story to tell. They spent their days on the road and didn't make a lot of money, so they always depended on fans to find places to stay. After playing a show, there was a particular fan who seemed really interested. He offered them a place to stay. His parents were really involved in their church and absent from the house. The band members were kind of curious about this, so they asked him if his parents were on a mission. He just kind of awkwardly smiled and didn't answer the question. Later that night, the band members were getting hungry and thought about raiding the guy's fridge. However, they decided since he was being such a good host that they didn't want to be rude. A few days later, they saw a story on the news about a guy who killed his parents, chopped them up, and put them in the freezer. The guy who was arrested under suspicion was the guy they had stayed with. His parents were in the freezer when they talked about raiding the fridge. Did it happen? I don't know. Could it happen? Sure. Either way, I'm glad nobody got eaten or killed. Besides the parents, I'm sorry about that. This was told to me by my aunt. My apologies for any lack of detail, as my grandmother died years before I was born, and also, I don't know how true this is. First off, my mother was one of 10 children. When she was a teen, her parents and half her siblings moved to the east. My aunts and uncles have told me that something was strange about that house. They would hear voices running upstairs when no one was there, a rocking chair would rock when no one was in it, and so on. Eventually, my grandmother was diagnosed with brain cancer. She was in her bed at home recuperating from her most recent surgery, and my aunt was there alone taking care of her. My grandmother was completely bedbound at this point. It was impossible for her to walk. She had a funny tendency to blot at her healing incisions on her scalp with tissues, which is kinda not so great for them. Because of this, the tissue box was kept across the room from her bed. My aunt brought in my grandmother's lunch on a tray and set it down on my grandmother's lap. My grandmother asked her for the tissues for her head, and my aunt reminded her that she was not supposed to do that. My grandmother then asked for a drink. My aunt went to the kitchen and brought back her drink when she sees her mother with the tissues, still in bed, blotting her head. My aunt takes them away and again reminds her that she shouldn't do that. This is when she realizes that my grandmother cannot get out of bed, so she asks, "Mom, how did you even get these?" My grandmother replied, "Oh, that little girl that always follows you around gave them to me." Last year, I worked with a guy who'd spent some time on oil rigs in the North Sea. He told me that there was a real huge storm, pounded the shit out of the place, that happened all the time there. In the morning, they had to assess the damage, and they saw that there's this platform down by the water that was partially submerged. Normally it's just above the waterline. So, being low guy on the totem pole, he went down first, and he told me that the whole thing was a death trap, the platform barely hanging on. He told me that he got to the bottom, where the rest was in the water, and just as soon as he stepped on it, the water started sinking fast. He had to run up the stairs, and when he got to the landing above, the whole thing under him just broke off and sank. But what got me is when he said that it wasn't like it just sank. It was like the metal was pulled until it broke, like something big grabbed it from underneath and pulled it down. And whatever it was only did that when he stepped into the water, like it had been a trap. He told me after that they kept getting damage they couldn't explain. Metal ladders broke and pipes sheared off, always during storms. Sometimes guys went missing, which was the worst. He told me that they told the media that they had to evacuate the place because of some kind of leak, but that was the real reason, and eventually the whole place was going to go down. And he said the same thing had happened to other places in the North Sea. If I know if he was lying, but I thought it was creepy. So here's a story of my friend. He lives in an apartment complex in the city. The place is 10 stories high, and he lives on the 8th. One night, he was going home and arrived at the main lobby at around 11 p.m. He waited for the elevator, and when the door opened, a man rudely bumped into him and hurriedly walked out of the lobby. My friend didn't think much of it until he got back to his room. As he looked into his bathroom mirror to brush his teeth, he found bits of blood on the very shoulder the man had bumped. The next day was a Saturday, and he was getting ready for a date. He had just taken a shower when he heard a knock on the door. Peering through the eye hole, he saw a policeman. The policeman was a guy in his mid-40s with short dark hair with a shaved off left eyebrow. The policeman asked through the door, "There was a murder last night at around 10:50 p.m. and I would like to ask if you saw anything in particular." My friend did see something in particular. He bumped into a man that bloodied his shoulder, but he replied, "No sir, I know nothing of the sort." My friend was already late for his date and didn't want to get involved. The police responded, "All right, thank you for your time," and left. My friend went to his date and came back home later that day feeling a bit guilty. He lied to a police officer. Then he flicked on the TV and the news was talking about the murder at his apartment. Great, he thought. Way to make me feel more guilty. But then the news went on to say that the killer was caught. The culprit's photo came on the screen. And there the murderer was. A guy in his mid-40s with short dark hair with a shaved off left eyebrow. He wasn't a police officer. He was a man who was out to kill the witnesses. This is a true story. My grandfather, roughly 15 years ago, once woke my grandmother up at 4 a.m. with no shoes and bloodied feet. Naturally, she asks him what had happened. He was very confused and could not really comprehend what happened to him. What he told my grandmother frightened her so terribly. He said that he was woken up at about 12 a.m. at night by a bright light and strange noises. The next thing he knew, he was in a small town about 5 miles from his house. He walked home disoriented, barefoot for those 5 miles in the cold winter. His feet were cold and numb and bloody. My grandmother asked who took him away. He could not answer. His mind froze up. Still haunts the shit out of me, not knowing what happened. I'm a camp counselor, and I told a variation of the Slender Man story where he was a traditional fae that followed colonists to the New World and went insane and started killing people by stalking the naughty children who stayed out late. Oh, and by the way, my gimmick as a storyteller is that all my stories are true, and I worked up to this story over 4 weeks, starting with tame shit, and I ended with that. All my campers were crying, as were some of my coworkers. I scared myself so much that I refused to leave my cabin after full dark for the remaining 3 days I was there.